I cannot believe that it has been a full year since we last hosted our Ideas on Tap program in person at the Viking Braggett Company Southtown location. I want to thank those of you who have continued to join me each month virtually here for Ideas on Tap, and I know we're all looking forward to the days when we can gather safely again. During this evening's talk, we'll be posting a link to a brief survey in the comments on both Zoom and Facebook. Please consider taking a minute or two to fill it out, as your feedback will help us improve future virtual programs, and you'll be entered to win a $25 gift card to Viking Braggett. If you enjoyed tonight's program, we're asking that you please consider making a secure, tax-deductible donation of $5 to $10 at the web address listed on the screen to help keep museum programs like this one accessible to all. That's giving.uoregon.edu/MNCHgift. Your donation directly supports the museum's educational programming, bringing science and culture adventures to Oregonians of every age and in every corner of the state. Thank you. Lastly, I hope that you'll join me next month for another Ideas on Tap. On Wednesday, April 7th, University of Oregon oceanographer Dave Sutherland will discuss the iceberg life cycle and how Greenlandic iceberg melt is affecting global climate, from sea level rise to ocean circulation. If you can't join us live, we do post recordings of all of our virtual talks to the museum's page the following day, so be sure to check out any talks that you've missed. And now it's my pleasure to introduce this evening's speaker, Dr. Claire Herbert. Claire is an assistant professor of sociology at the University of Oregon. Her research interests include housing and homelessness, race, poverty and inequality, property rights and land use, and incarceration and prisoner reentry. She joins us this evening to explore issues related to Eugene's affordable housing crisis. Welcome, Claire.
Thank you. All right, should I go ahead and share my screen?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Again, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here and talk with everyone tonight. I am, as Lauren said, I'm a sociologist in the sociology department here at U of O. I recently moved back to Eugene after working at Drexel University in Philadelphia, and I was at University of Michigan before that. And I was actually an undergrad in the sociology department at U of O. So some of my sort of context and some of the things I'll be discussing about housing sort of come from some of these different perspectives of what housing instability and homelessness are like in these different places, these different contexts. Wait, hold on, I have to adjust something here on my screen. There we go. So again, housing is one of my primary areas of research, and my work really intersects with law and criminology as well. So some of what I'll be drawing on for this talk today is my prior research studying the housing trajectories of former prisoners in Michigan. I also have done work looking at squatting in Detroit, which I frame as a mode of informal housing. This generally refers to housing practices that violate sort of laws and social norms. And squatting is also one form of property informality that I examine in my new book, which I just have to quickly plug here. It's called A Detroit Story, Urban Decline and the Rise of Property Informality. And it's set to come out on March 16th from the University of California Press. But since moving back here to Eugene, I've been particularly interested in examining some of these issues and how they manifest here, of course, a very different context than cities like Philadelphia or Detroit, where I've spent the last however many years. And especially with regard to informal housing, which looks very different because Eugene doesn't have a lot of vacant houses for people to squat in. And so instead we see, as everyone knows, I'm sure if you're in Eugene, see a lot of people living in tents or in RVs or living in vehicles. I'm also interested in sort of how our student population is navigating different obstacles related to housing and homelessness, given that we live in a city that recently had in 2019, had the highest rate of homelessness in the country. So the plan for my talk tonight is I'm first going to sort of cover some background issues about homelessness and housing instability to situate how we typically think about these problems. And then I'll sort of walk through some of how these problems are presenting with regard to former prisoners, students, and the informally housed residents in our city. Oops. There we go. So I want to talk briefly about sort of the history of housing and homelessness in the United States. So in the early 20th century, homelessness was this era of tramps and transients. And homelessness at this point in time was actually defined more by one's level of disaffiliation with family and society. And this was, so homelessness referred to one sort of lacking a place in society. So it was primarily referenced to men who maybe weren't married, didn't have children, were unemployed or sporadically employed, who maybe sort of shunned socially acceptable behaviors and were very transient. And so at this point in time, homelessness wasn't so much about not having a house, but it was lacking sort of a rootedness in society. And now researchers understand us to have sort of shifted to this modern day homelessness. And this really began to arise around the 1970s when street homelessness became really visible. Some people may have recollections of this sort of transition in society, and researchers were really sort of struck by the number and visibility of homeless people in different urban areas. So it was at this point that researchers and the public started noticing, that outside of a shelter at night, there was suddenly a long line, or that there was an increase in people panhandling, and that this homelessness just became a much more visible problem. And so researchers all sort of, honed their attention to understand, wait a minute, why are we seeing all of this dramatic rise in homelessness? So there's we've seen a big increase in attention to housing among social scientists since around the late 1970s and to mid 80s and onward, obviously. But so the kind of housing crisis that we're dealing with today, we could say that we've been experiencing a housing crisis since the 1970s. But it's not something new. Unfortunately, it's sort of just a reoccurrence and deeper entrenchment of the problems that led to this increase in the first place. So a couple of the sort of primary reasons or primary ways that we explain this dramatic growth in homelessness is first due to the deinstitutionalization of state-run mental health facilities in the 1970s and 80s, who we can largely thank the Reagan administration for. So there was, a technological and medical and community health kind of perspectives shifted, and we thought, hey, wait a minute, we can let people be cared for in their communities, but we failed to also provide the necessary resources to ensure that all people had the kind of supports they needed to not live in mental health facilities anymore, which is also why we have such a high correlation between people struggling with mental health problems and people living on the streets. There's also a dramatic decline in SRO housing. SRO stands for single room occupancy housing. And this is a common form of housing, especially in big cities. These were often high-rise apartment or kind of tenement buildings where people often shared small rooms. They might have shared a bathroom or a kitchen facility at the end of the hall. They were frequently very run down and in poor condition, but they were often kind of the last stop of housing for people on very, very limited incomes. And especially due to processes like gentrification in cities like San Francisco, these SROs were shut down or they were turned into condos and more upscale apartments. We also have the decline in public housing. So the federal government has shifted from the actual provision of housing to the provision of, you've probably heard of them, Section 8 vouchers. And these vouchers provide families or individuals the ability to pay a reduced rent for shopping and shop for housing on the private market. But again, in closing the public housing units, our government has failed to provide enough money and resources to Section 8 vouchers in order to meet demand. So in many in many cities, we have waiting lists that are closed or have been closed for multiple years because there's just too much demand. Also, we have stagnating real wages and rising housing costs. And researchers now say that most Americans are one crisis away from being homeless. So the rise in the prevalence of housing security in the US means that a lot of individuals and families are one crisis away from homelessness. If they have a house fire, they're homeless. A job loss, they're homeless. Health problems, they end up homeless because they don't have the kind of cushion or safety net that they need in order to be able to stay stably housed through a crisis like that. And so one researcher named Joel Blau, who is a prominent figure in some of this housing and homelessness literature that has arisen since the 1980s, he writes that more than any other single phenomenon, it is the interaction between the relative decline of income and the relative increase in housing costs that explains the growth of the homeless population. So it's important to sort of, in some sense, recognize that there are some very simple but significant contributors to the housing problems that we are enduring and have been enduring for the last 40 plus years. So federal definitions of homelessness come from the McKinney-Vento Homeless Assistance Act. And I want to talk about a couple of these because it's important to think about the way that we are situating different homeless practices or different housing practices. So the McKinney-Vento defines homelessness as the lack of a fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime residence, or people residing in places not intended for regular shelter, including cars, parks, abandoned buildings, vehicles, camping grounds. This also includes people living in a shelter or people who are exiting an institution like prison or even rehab or a mental health facility who were homeless prior to entering. The definitions also include people who are with incomes below 30% of the median for their area, people who lack resources to immediately attain stable housing, people who are experiencing frequent moves for economic reasons, and people living in all of these less than ideal housing situations. So what this means is that we are increasingly able to think about housing as existing on a spectrum or a continuum. Wait, I think I skipped a slide. Oh. Yes, okay, sorry. McKinney-Vento also defines these as at risk of homelessness. That was the key point I forgot to mention with this slide, is that they're not just defining who's homeless, but they're also just defining populations of people that are at risk of losing their housing. And this is in part because researchers are increasingly recognizing that housing exists on a continuum. So rather than thinking about, hey, I am housed and I am homeless, we think about people being stably housed at one end, to people housed, but in situations that are less than desirable or that are precarious in some way, and then stretching over to people living in shelters or people living on the streets, right? So it's a continuum, and it's important to think about it that way because people frequently sort of move between different forms of housing, and that certain housing situations put people at risk of being outright homeless. So people who are stably housed include homeowners or renters who are spending less than 30% of their monthly income on housing costs. People who are cost burdened are spending more than 30% of their monthly income on housing costs. And extremely rent burdened people spend more than 50% of their monthly income on housing. So I oftentimes in my classes, I ask my students to pause and calculate for themselves whether or not they are cost burdened or extremely cost burdened. And many of them are very surprised to find out the category that they fall under. So I invite you all to calculate that if you're so interested. Other forms of unstable housing, though, again, include being doubled up or in overcrowded conditions or in unsafe or unhealthy housing conditions, like housing that is deteriorated. And the reason it's important to think about these situations of people who sort of exist on this precarious moment between being stably housed or being outright homeless is because it's a lot easier to prevent people from becoming homeless than to help people become stably housed once they are homeless. If we can prevent people from, being evicted or having to move out an apartment because they can't afford the rent, then we prevent the trauma of that experience. We prevent them potentially losing their belongings and their things. We prevent them experiencing the sort of general instability in their lives that can compromise their mental health, their jobs, their kids' stability in school. And it's also, if you're not compelled by those kind of moral reasons, it's also a lot cheaper to prevent people from becoming homeless than to help them gain stable housing once they are homeless. So relatedly, we also then talk about what we call the temporality of homelessness. And so this is the sort of different ways in which people experience homelessness throughout time. So the first one is episodic homelessness. And this is an experience of entering and exiting homelessness frequently. Now, a typical pathway for someone who experiences episodic homelessness might be that they were living in a rent subsidized apartment and then lost access to that subsidy. So they ended up in a shelter while they were trying to find a place to live, maybe got access to a market rate apartment, but could not sustain that rent over time. And so they moved out and moved in with a family member. And then in that situation, they're doubled up. And then maybe that situation gets difficult and they end up back in the shelter for a while, right? And it's just this kind of cyclical pattern over the years where people experience a lot of those kinds of transitions. Second is transitional homelessness. And this is an experience of homelessness that accompanies a transition. And I'm imagining that a lot of people who are watching right now might know someone who has experienced transitional homelessness if you're in the Eugene or Lane County area, because people who lost their homes to the fire would be classified as experiencing transitional homelessness. For most people in this category, it's kind of a once in a lifetime situation, right, where they lose their home, but it was due to factors beyond their control. And then after that, they remain stably housed in some form for the rest of their lives. And then chronic homelessness. And this is the kind of the face of homelessness. This is the stereotypical experience or sort of caricature of a homeless individual. Federal definitions define chronically homeless as being homeless for at least 1 year or 4 times in the last 3 years. This is the population that can be the most difficult to help maintain stable housing long-term, in part because many of them have experienced being without a stable place to live for so long. That transition can be really difficult. And chronic homelessness costs our society the most in terms of funding to try to help and navigate the problem, which is why if we think back to someone experiencing episodic homelessness, if we can prevent people from becoming homeless, it saves us so many resources, as well as it saves those individuals that trauma. So now I'm going to shift and talk about, again, some of these different populations that I personally am interested in terms of my areas of research, but that I think are worth discussing in regards to Eugene. And I'm going to start here by talking about formerly incarcerated people, in part because Eugene has this really amazing model for supporting this population. So I want to start off on a really positive note. So if you are familiar with sponsors, that's who I'm about to talk about. It's an organization I'm going to talk about. So housing for formerly incarcerated people has been an interest of mine, in part because there's a lot of overlap between people who are formerly incarcerated and populations that experience homelessness in terms of demographics. But nearly 700,000 people in the United States are released from prison each year. And this is a massive number of people who are sort of faced with the daunting task of how to reenter society successfully. And when we talk about successful reentry, it means we're talking about the ability to desist from crime or to not recidivate and end up incarcerated again. So research shows that stable housing and social supports help prevent recidivism. And, housing is kind of this basis for stability that allows people to get all these other facets of their life sort of put together and stabilized. But former prisoners also face a lot of obstacles to securing stable housing. Many of them don't qualify for subsidized housing, depending on where they live. Sometimes they can't live with family members due to their conviction record or the stipulations of their parole if they're on parole, right? So if you're an individual who is on parole, your parole might stipulate that you can't live in a residence with another person who has a felony conviction, for example. And so if you have another family member who has one, you're not allowed to live together per your parole. Formerly incarcerated people also face a lot of discrimination by landlords. If you're in a hot property market and you get to choose who's, living in your apartment, oftentimes formerly incarcerated people are discriminated against in that context. And as well, people who are reentering oftentimes struggle to find gainful employment, in large part because of similar sort of axes of discrimination. And so that lack of income complicates the ability to get stable housing as well. But as a society, we all have an interest, right, in ensuring that people are reentering successfully and not further recidivating or getting returned to prison. And so we have an organization like Sponsors here. And I'm talking about sponsors in part because that increasingly they're sort of being recognized as a model that other cities across the country can adopt in attempting to serve this population. So Sponsors was started in 1973 doing general reentry services. And today they manage 20 buildings on 6 sites. They have over 240 beds of transitional, long-term, and permanent housing for people with criminal histories. And a lot of this I've learned about and gained from a housing and homelessness course I taught where I had sponsors come in and chat with my students. So this Sponsors targets people who are released from state or county correctional facilities, men and women who are convicted as adults and assessed at moderate to high risk, seniors, women with children, veterans, people with disabilities and mental illness, and people convicted of sex offenses. And these are all populations that face just sort of intersecting obstacles or barriers to securing stable housing, which is why Sponsors is especially focusing on stability for them. Sponsors also provides what we call wraparound services, which means that in addition to helping people maintain stable housing, they're providing opportunities for them to address other obstacles that they may face to successful reentry, like mental health services or getting help finding employment, parenting classes, things like that. And so the sort of really exciting piece of this is there's been some recent program evaluations of Sponsors, which is when an organization, sort of an outside research team comes in and tries to assess to what extent are they achieving their goals. And so from September 2018 to September 2020, Sponsors placed 97 homeless individuals reentering from prison in permanent supportive housing. They issued 115 Section 8 vouchers. And the outcomes of this are that 91% of the individuals placed in housing remain stably housed and have not been convicted of a new felony offense. And this is just a really great opportunity to recognize Sponsors as a model, right, that other places can begin to implement if they're trying to serve and support this population. So the next population I want to talk about is students. And this is sort of an increasing interest and concern of mine because having moved now to a college town, you think about students being a population that oftentimes don't have access to a lot of monetary resources. They're also funding something that's incredibly expensive. And in Eugene in particular, we have very, very high rates of homelessness and a pretty expensive property market. So some researchers across the country have been sort of increasing their attention to housing instability among students. That was my dog. And they have surveyed students at colleges across the country. I don't believe the University of Oregon was included in any of the surveys they've conducted so far. But in 2019, they found that 1 in 10 undergraduates are homeless, that 45% of college students overall experience housing insecurity, and in particular that community college students are at a greater risk of experiencing housing obstacles than students at 4-year institutions. So at 2-year institutions, they found that 33% of students are housing insecure and 14% experience homelessness. So again, remember back to housing insecure can mean that they're paying too much. It can mean that they're living in overcrowded conditions. It can mean that they are facing an eviction or don't know where money for rent is going to come from in the next couple of months, or they're living in substandard conditions. And then at 4-year institutions, that rate of homelessness drops down to about 2%. And so increasingly, I think this is, something that especially small college towns need to be thinking about is how is their student population doing in terms of housing stability? So this research, these existing surveys find that that students who are experiencing housing insecurity, that really increases the likelihood that they will drop out of college. And obviously this is an undesirable outcome for any student, for any institution, for society more generally. This means that we have more and more students who are leaving college with student debt, but without that degree that helps them navigate that those kind of financial obstacles moving forward. And see. So now I'm going to talk and switch to talk about informally housed residents. And again, this generally refers, when I talk about informal housing, this is a sort of a lens or framework that has predominantly been applied to parts of the global South, but increasingly researchers are using this as a conceptual framework to understand different housing practices or economic practices, even in the United States. So people whose method of sheltering violates the law is kind of the umbrella term, or that umbrella situation for informal housing. This might include people who are squatting, people who are living in tents, people who are living in cars or RVs, or in more rural areas. Oftentimes we're finding more and more kind of self-built housing or self-built sheltering options that don't conform to kind of the regulations surrounding building codes and things like that. And in particular, tent living and car and RV living has increased in number and visibility during the pandemic. And we're still waiting for some numbers to come out about like point in time counts of homeless populations that have since the pandemic has started. But we do know that shelters are operating at reduced capacity because of social distancing requirements. And also that the CDC has recommended that governments not conduct sweeps on public property. So what this means is that when people are sleeping or camping on public property, that the CDC has recommended that the government let them stay there, provided that they are not sort of violating or posing a public health concern. So it leaves a lot of kind of interpretive wiggle room for government still to conduct sweeps when they want to under public health, sort of under the guise of public health concerns. But it's also contributed to the prevalence that, you know, just the visibility of, especially in Eugene, of tents and RVs and things like that where people are living. So the obstacles of being unhoused are compounded when you are also living in violation of the law. So this is something that we oftentimes don't think about, is that if you're unhoused, where do you keep your things? Where do you maintain and reproduce life? Where do you, not only where do you sleep, but where do you, conduct the biological functions that you need to do? Where, your life is sort of rendered illegal if you don't have a place that you are legally allowed to be and to carry out these practices. So increasingly on the West Coast, cities have been for the last 20 plus years now rolling out what we call quality of life ordinances. And these sort of arose with the desire to sort of clean up the appearance of downtown areas as businesses are trying to attract people back downtown with gentrification. One example is there's an ordinance in Seattle that says you can't sit on the sidewalk. And again, scholars sort of conceptualize these as rendering people's lives illegal, because if you don't have a place where you can legally be, where are you supposed to reproduce and maintain your life? And so I call out some of these obstacles because not only do people, of course, experience a host of obstacles being unhoused, but there's an added sort of layer when those practices are illegal, right? Because then there's always the threat of law or some sort of authority enforcement to attempt to intervene in their lives. So formalizing these practices, these informal housing practices, can reduce the burdens of living in violation of the law for individuals who are experiencing that. It can increase the safety and stability for residents who are living in tents and vehicles. If you're legally permitted to put your tent somewhere, then you don't have to worry that you're going to be forced to move at 5 o'clock in the morning. And so there are two examples of programs in Eugene that I'm still learning more about, but that are promising in a number of ways. So the Dusk to Dawn program is a safe parking place, or provides safe parking places for people living in cars or in RVs. So they can park from 4:30 p.m. to 7:30, that should say 7:30 a.m., sorry. And then rest stops are safe camping sites, and there are 9 that have currently been approved. And these safe camping spaces provide typically space for around 20 individuals to live. And the benefits of these, again, are that it allows people to engage in the sheltering practices that they have at their disposal without being increasingly, or without the added burden of those practices being illegal. So, sorry, this is a map here that the pink stars show the new proposed sites, and the let's see, the yellow ones, I believe, show the current rest stop sites in Eugene and Springfield. So there are some obstacles, however, with addressing informal housing. So sort of from a legal perspective, if we formalize these practices, we can send the message that substandard or that substandard housing is acceptable for certain populations and people. So if we start saying, look, it's fine if everyone lives in a tent when they need to, we're going to decriminalize it and we're just going to let everyone, live in tents or in vehicles, it can send the message that that's appropriate. And as a society, we have things like, building codes, which attempt to regulate the safety and also the appearance, but primarily the safety of buildings where people are supposed to inhabit. We've kind of deemed that, we have certain regulations and enforcements in place to protect people. And if we are saying it's okay also for people to live in tents, then we're also saying that those substandard conditions are acceptable. At the same time, if we take a different approach and try to criminalize these practices, and try to sort of get rid of the opportunity to informally shelter oneself, then we're layering on punishments and obstacles for people who already cannot afford to conform to the law in terms of maintaining traditional housing. So neither of those approaches is really ideal. And this is this tension that some legal scholars in this arena are trying to suss out, is how do we then help people by not further burdening them by saying, look, you can't live in a tent if that's your only option, but also how do we not, as a society, sort of accept this dramatic reduction in safety and security for people? So I like sort of in this arena of trying to think through how to address informal housing in the sort of most socially just way, I think it's productive to think of these as harm reduction strategies that intervene in the immediate harms that people experience by being unsheltered or homeless. So some of these include, right, that if you're living in a tent or in a vehicle, you have to find a place to put it where no one's going to bother you. You're subject to more instances of being unsafe. You also have the constant work of finding out where to go and where to be. And the rest stops and safe parking intervene in some of these harms, right? They provide some stability for people. They provide some added layers of safety for people. At a very simple level, the rest stops allow people who are unhoused to have a place to keep their things, right? So you don't have to carry everything you have around with you or risk it being swept if you're not there or someone stealing it or something like that. So it creates space where people can legally carry out these different aspects of their lives. And so in some ways, these are harm reduction strategies because they intervene in those immediate harms to the best of our ability at this moment. At the same time, in order, again, to not inadvertently sanction these and say, look, it's fine if a lot of our population is living without safety or dry conditions or without utilities or restroom facilities, then we also, though, need to be making progress towards the goals of providing safe, healthy, up-to-code housing for everyone who wants it. And it's also important to recognize that a lot of traditional models of housing aren't a good fit for people. So some people don't want to live in an apartment or in a house and might prefer something like a tiny house village where there are more models of that. People might prefer living in an RV or something where they have more mobility, or they may prefer camping, but need sort of the proper setup and safe and secure places to be able to do that. And so I think that in envisioning solutions to these housing problems, we also need to expand our thinking about what constitutes housing and how we can make sure that everyone has access to something that is safe and stable and that fits the needs that they really have. And that's where I am concluding tonight. So I really look forward to any questions or comments anyone has. Thank you. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Claire. That was excellent. I know we say this every time, Zoom is super weird, so let's just imagine a full room of people applauding for you. And then we'll go ahead and jump into the questions. So we've had a few coming in, but I do want to just remind people that if you have questions and you're watching here on Zoom, you can use the Q&A or the chat box. If you're on Facebook, you can drop it into the comments, and I will be collecting from both of those platforms as we go. So relating to the current pandemic, since we are gathered here on Zoom holding this presentation tonight, one of the viewers is wondering how Eugene compares with other cities as far as conducting sweeps during the pandemic despite CDC guidelines.
That's a great question, and I don't know the numbers, to be honest. I do know that it's happening, that there are still sweeps taking place, and that there is some tension and concern that that government is, again, sort of using this, it's a public health concern as a justification for conducting sweeps when people are just in spaces that, either are desired for use by someone else, or, the businesses don't want people close to their business. So I do know that it's being used as a justification, and the extent to which there's actually sort of a public health concern with individual groups of campers is sometimes it's very muddy and unclear if that's actually going on, but I don't have any numbers on that, unfortunately.
No problem. You can't be expected to know everything. Full numbers out of the air. So there's a question here, and I think we can all just preface this and agree that lots of different things are exacerbating the housing crisis here in Eugene and Springfield. But this person is wondering, what are your thoughts on the University of Oregon's role in potentially exacerbating the most recent housing crisis for Eugene and Springfield residents, and not for students, but for non-students living here?
That's a great question. And there's kind of this very small but growing body of literature within urban sociology and urban studies looking at the concept of studentification, drawing a parallel with gentrification, and concerns that as universities are expanding and trying to expand housing options for students, that they're creeping into neighborhoods and communities that have typically been housed by full-time residents, not just student populations. And there's been some, so I don't know precisely the extent to which that's happening in Eugene, but I mean, we can all see the development happening around the university, apartment buildings and things like that. And there's definitely kind of a pressure there, right? That for some student populations, some students have enough financial aid or parental support to be able to afford whatever cost of housing, kind of they're presented with, and that can, increase the property market or property values close to the university, and that can kind of bleed out further into neighborhoods. And so there's an issue of competition for space, as well as sort of how the student housing market influences the rest of the rental market. And especially when you have a small town like Eugene, I think that that's much more likely that the university kind of has that input on the overall population and housing costs.
Thanks. So we'll kind of switch gears a little bit. We're just going to be hopping all around to the many topics that you talked about tonight. So one of the viewers is wondering if you have ideas for smaller towns, such as Bend, without rest stops for setting up safe camping and parking locations, because the Bend City Council is meeting this evening, apparently, to discuss this.
I think that so there's been some reviews or some sort of analysis of the impacts of Eugene's rest stops, and they're really promising. And again, from this angle of like harm reduction, if we can stop making life so difficult for people who don't have housing, that's one less stressor that they have to worry about. So gosh, that's a time pressure there for Bend. But I think that in Eugene, they've been looking at trying to find locations that residents nearby are okay with. And when I first moved here, I didn't even realize that there's one just a couple blocks of my away from my house. And I think that looking at other models, like how Eugene has been adopting these programs and implementing spaces for rest stops, would be a great way to sort of motivate that in other cities.
Related to that, someone is wondering if there are cities other than Eugene that the Eugene Springfield area could look to for models to help with some housing solutions that might work locally.
Sorry, was that a question?
Yes. Well,
Sorry, so what are
that
we
was
looking at?
I asked that in a very roundabout way. I'm just going to ask the question. Are there any cities that we can look to as models for what housing solutions might work here, Eugene, Springfield?
You know, I think that cities like Eugene are actually kind of at the forefront of some of these housing problems. As we're, seeing different pressures kind of push up the West Coast, small towns like Eugene are actually kind of the forefront of some of these housing problems that we haven't, we don't have the size to sort of implement some of the approaches that cities like Los Angeles or San Francisco might be implementing. And there has been a lack of attention to cities the size of Eugene in terms of experiencing gentrification or skyrocketing housing prices. So it's an arena where we need more attention, we need more research taking place in contexts like Eugene. At the same time, there are some sort of tried and true models to address housing unaffordability, things like, I'm forgetting the exact term for it, but preventing people's property taxes from rising too much, which can help keep longtime homeowners in their houses. Altering zoning. Zoning is one of the biggest obstacles to affordable housing in this country, because oftentimes we zone certain neighborhoods for only very large single family homes on big lots, and increasing density is, I guess that is something that we can take from some of these big cities. Is increasing density is a way to increase housing affordability as well. And I know Eugene has been undertaking some of these, like allowing different forms of accessory dwelling units. That has had a really good impact in other places as well. There's also, placing rent caps so that landlords can't raise rents too quickly over time. And having really strong tenants unions can be really, really important as well.
So, somewhat related to that, this person is wondering if you have any information on how much housing is available or is vacant within the Eugene Springfield area, and the ratio of rent to income in our area, kind of going back to those issues you're talking about of people who were at risk of experiencing homelessness.
Yep. Again, I don't know the numbers, but I do know that Eugene and Springfield have a very, very low vacancy rate. And when we have very, very low vacancy rates, that's when we start to see some, it's kind of like a pressure, right? Like the pressure increases because it's harder for people to move when they need to move because there are fewer properties available for rent or for sale. It's easier then for landlords to raise costs when there's a lot of demand for property because there's few vacancies. So I know all those sort of processes are intersecting here, but I don't know the numbers.
So someone is wondering if free public housing for those who need it could be an option, and is this something that's just too expensive, and are any cities experimenting with something like this right now?
I don't know about free public housing. There is a model called Housing First that has been increasingly adopted. And so sort of I guess you could call it a traditional model of helping people shift from living on the streets to being housed. It used to be like a stair-step model, right? So it was as though you had to prove yourself to be ready to be housed. So first you had to, prove that you could make it to your doctor's appointments. And then you had to go to various sorts of, employment classes, and then you had to get employment, and then you had to keep employment, and then finally you were deemed ready to be housed. And researchers and practitioners recognize that that's really kind of a convoluted way to think about housing, and that everyone deserves and is ready to be housed, and that providing stable housing first, that's where the name comes from, can be a platform that allows other people to get sort of other things together in their lives. And so that model there's a lot of evaluations that show that model is really effective. That first, what we need to do is just get people into housing, make sure it's secure, and then they can kind of address some of the other obstacles they have going on. But I haven't heard specifically about any programs that offer free public housing. Public housing means, right, that the government has built and is maintaining and operating the housing, and we've largely shifted away from that model in the United States, in part because we have, sort of different ideas about government's responsibility for taking care of its citizens. In a lot of parts in Europe, they have these really sort of well-organized squatters movements that target vacant public-owned housing or public housing because government actually sort of has a legal responsibility to provide housing for their residents, but we don't have that here.
Thanks. So we had some questions come in the Q&A, and one of the viewers is wondering how we get people who are experiencing homelessness to the table to talk about solutions.
That's a great question. And programmatic or policy interventions that aim to be that aim to be publicly responsible or responsive to the community, it can be really, really difficult to do that because certain populations have a really hard time getting to the table. So this was happening in Detroit. There was a lot of discussions about how do we improve the city. The city was experiencing a lot of problems. And various organizations hosted all these community meetings attempting to get input from Detroiters, but a lot of research shows that typically the people who can make it to those meetings are not the people that we're really trying to service and help. And so in that arena, if we're trying to do outreach and connect with people who are unsheltered and find out what they need and what options they have or what ideas they have, it's going to require not only outreach, but probably some, funding to get people to the table, transportation, but even beyond that, a lot of people just don't have time when they're dealing with sort of multiple intersecting obstacles in life. They don't have time to come and sit there and, talk to city council members about plans for city redevelopment. So I think it's a necessary component in addressing our housing problems, but we have to be really cognizant of what it's going to take to make those kind of community engagements actually accessible to people who are experiencing homelessness, for example.
Right. Yeah, I would imagine it would be difficult to find the time to attend a meeting. And when you have so many other things that you're worried about just day to day.
Yeah.
So someone is wondering, you referred to options where people might get to choose their housing preferences, like if some people prefer camping or their RV to some sort of housing where there's like the tiny houses.
Yeah.
Is Eugene, as far as you know, heading in this direction where there's more choice for people?
I think that Eugene has a history and a reputation of thinking outside the box. And I think that plays really well into thinking about alternative models for housing. So one thing I talk about in my book is that for people who are squatting in Detroit, there's a lot of different motivations. Some people are doing it because they're outright homeless. Whereas sort of at the other end of the spectrum, some people are doing it because they think it's kind of a fun adventure. It's a lot of, white younger kids moving in from the suburbs who are coming to squat houses and land and farm them and things like that. And to recognize that there's a lot of diversity among the motivations that people have when they undertake these sort of informal housing practices. And I think we see that increasingly as well with things like living in RVs or, van life. Some people are living in vehicles because that's their only option. Other people are doing that because they want the freedom and the flexibility and they don't want to be tied down with a lot of possessions. And that's also legitimate. And historically, right, the United States has really prioritized the single family home and home ownership. The federal government subsidizes home ownership so much in comparison to other forms of housing. And so it's really sort of a priority culturally and historically and in policy terms, but it's not a good fit for everyone. And when we can reimagine different ways of providing people with the safety and the security and stability that they seek, that I think that's where we can think up really creative ways to do that and be able to sort of meet more people where they are. So I think that we see some evidence of that in Eugene with like the tiny house village, and even expanding options for ADUs, which can provide smaller dwelling units for people. But we also need to, think about how to support people who want to live in vans and RVs, and have that be able to be stable and safe for them as well, or even potentially people who are interested in living out of tents, and make sure that that's possible for people in a way that's safe and healthy, and then they're not forced to do that because they don't have any other option.
So this next question you kind of just covered, but maybe you'll have something slightly different to add based on how it's phrased. So is it hard to form solutions for housing issues because of the wide range of reasons that people might fall under the various title of homeless? And what are some solutions or plans that you've seen work or are working in communities?
That's great. Great question. Yeah, I think that oftentimes we create more problems when we don't meet people where they are in terms of their particular needs or desires for shelter. And what people want is really important and ought to be acknowledged and respected. And sometimes when we're trying to sort of take people who, maybe someone who doesn't want to live in an apartment complex and say, look, this is your option for housing, either you take it or leave it, that creates a mismatch, right, between what people's needs are and where they are in terms of sort of their own life and what opportunities we have for housing. Let's see, I would say, I think more and more cities are experimenting with things like tiny house villages, and offering them in sort of different models. Sponsors now has tiny houses, which is fabulous. In Detroit, there is a program building, an organization building tiny houses that people would rent for a number of years for very low cost rent, and they would work up toward purchasing it, which then gave them equity and a small amount of wealth that then they could sell the house if they wanted to, and kind of begin to enter that housing market. We often talk about housing as kind of a ladder, right? People move up to bigger and more expensive forms of housing and then decline and downsize as they get older. And entering in tiny houses as a homeowner is one way to kind of begin to move up that ladder if that's the path they want to go. Other places have used tiny houses as just forms of low cost or subsidized housing, but I haven't seen any sort of really creative models beyond that I'm aware of in cities yet. I have seen, and I think it's in San Francisco, right, micro apartments, which is providing, these tiny, tiny little apartment units, primarily geared toward younger adults with a lot of shared space. And that's also kind of alternative model, but it's much more geared toward, middle and upper incomes. But I think that more cities are getting a little bit more creative in some ways.
So I've heard about this next question in, I believe it might have been like an NPR news article or something. But someone is wondering if there are any programs, and if we want to talk about it locally, or if you want to talk about outside Eugene, to pair people who live alone in large homes with individuals who are in need of a place to live.
Yeah, actually, I've heard about programs like this as well. In my knowledge of it has been for kind of primarily targeting older residents who, again, might live in the house where they raised their kid and now it's too big for them. They have empty rooms, and they can pair with younger adults or even students. I believe this was a program in Ann Arbor when I was at University of Michigan, where students could get paired up to live with a person who was living alone and had extra space. And I think that those kind of alternative co-housing opportunities are also really great, but it's also a bit, goes against some people's cultural norms, right? About privacy and sharing space. And so we have to sort of maybe grow awareness or increase sort of understanding of what programs like that might look like. But I think that those can be positive as well, because sometimes older people are not able to stay in their homes anymore because they can't live alone, but only need maybe minor assistance with a few things. And having a younger person be able to live in their house can, it benefits both people in that way.
So we've had a few people asking variations on this question, and I apologize to the person watching on Facebook who asked this. I think there might be a typo, so I'm just going to ask it the way that I think they meant to ask it. We've talked repeatedly about how the homeless community is really varied and complex. So do you have any suggestions for how the unhoused can be supported in their lives?
I think to think through a question like that, I would think first about the fact that one of the biggest obstacles people who are unhoused face is that they do not have the legal right to be anywhere. And that, I mean, just think about that. It's so complex, right? To know that to lay down and sleep somewhere, you don't have somewhere you can legally be. And one way we can actually start to sort of challenge that and rethink that is by creating commons. And, you know, we've sort of long abandoned the idea of commons like centuries ago, but if there are some people who advocate creating, you know, commons in city centers or sort of scattered throughout a city, meaning places where anyone can be for any amount of time that have resources like bathrooms and showers, places to lock up things, you know, storage lockers, places where you're allowed to be with your pets, sort of all of the things that we who are housed get to enjoy in our private spaces. But when you don't have the legal right to be anywhere, just providing that space where you can legally be and not be sort of threatened in your existence can be positive and can sort of meet a variety of different people where they are. I think I diverted from the question there. So if there's a piece of it I should readdress, but the idea of commons came into my head, and I think that's a really important one to put out there.
Yeah, I think your response was great. So I'm sure in your line of work, you've heard a lot about Oregon House Bill 2001 at this point, possibly.
I actually don't. Well, remind me which one's that.
My understanding of it is that it has to do with the dezoning that you mentioned earlier, where you can start to develop more in what was previously R1 housing. So someone is wondering if you think the implementation of missing middle housing in Eugene per Oregon House Bill 2001 is going to relieve some of the local pressures contributing to homelessness and housing instability.
I'm going to guess yes, and it's an educated guess based on other research that what we're experiencing kind of nationwide. Remember, I sort of talked about the fact that we talk about housing careers. So people kind of start out in an apartment, and then maybe they get their starter home, and then they move into a bigger home in the suburbs, and then they downsize to a condo, right? That you kind of move through these housing stages throughout life. And what's happened due to the rise in housing costs and decreasing wages is that we've got this glut of people who have sort of stayed in that like entry level housing because that's what's affordable for them. And if we but that also means that then people who are trying to enter the housing market, whether it's rental or, you know, home ownership markets, is that there's not enough of that low to middle income housing available, right? There's not enough, people haven't been able to kind of move up that housing ladder and make that housing available for people coming behind them. And so I believe that building housing that sort of meets that lower to middle income range would do a lot in terms of some allowing other people to gain access to that range of housing.
So just pairing on that, like with the issues of the studentification that you were talking about earlier, do you know of any areas where something like this has been done, but in a college town, and how those two things end up sort of melding? Because some might imagine that those entry level housing situations would then be priced to those students who could afford for their parents to pay for them to be there.
That's very possible. And, you know, leaving housing to the free market poses all sorts of problems for us. When housing is a commodity, that, you know, or that housing functions as a commodity in a society is one of the biggest problems that we have. Because we're, you know, when you have a student population that is able to pay higher rents than some of the students, at least, are able to pay much higher rents than local residents, then that really complicates who's able to gain access to really desirable housing in the area or housing that's affordable for them.
So we're about to wrap up, but we have time for one more question. So I just want to ask this one and see if you have any solutions that you envision to address homelessness.
Oh, just generally?
Yeah, someone is asking, what kinds of solutions do you envision to address
Okay.
homelessness? You know, big picture.
Yep. Okay, here's my big picture pitch is we need to rethink the structure of property access and property rights, because a lot of what this boils down to, as I was kind of alluding to, is the fact that when people don't have a legal right to housing or to access a housing, a private dwelling, a private property, then they are sort of rendered effectively, illegal. And we need to create access to space. And in our society, property or space is property, right? It's owned, it's governed, it's regulated by individuals, government, public property, et cetera. And we need to create a new sort of structure or formulation of property that allows people to have space to be when they can't otherwise afford access to a private dwelling. And so doing things like creating common spaces is a good first step. Authorizing use of land and property in alternative ways is a good step as well. But we also need to think more broadly about some of the problems that cause people to move from being stably housed into unstably housed and then into homelessness. And this is things like not having high enough wages, that housing costs are too high generally, that we don't have enough social safety net in this country. I mean, in some ways, housing and homelessness is where sort of all the problems that we face in terms of politics and economics and discrimination, they kind of all intersect at housing. And housing is so fundamental to everyone's well-being that we really should be reformulating a way for everyone to have a right to housing in this country, whereas the United States does not, unfortunately. So that's my big picture take.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So we'll go ahead and leave it there. Thank you so much for your presentation tonight and having this chat with me at the end. It was great. Thanks to everyone who tuned in and those of you who were asking questions. Apologies if we didn't get to yours. We had quite a lot of them coming in tonight. So I want to remind everyone and plug Claire Herbert's book comes out in about 2 weeks. Do you want to share the title again?
A Detroit Story, Urban Decline and the Rise of Property Informality with the University of California Press.
Perfect. So be sure to pick up a copy if you want to hear more about that topic. And I hope everyone has a great evening, and we'll see you next month for another Ideas on Tap.
Thank you all.